Well, hello everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to this little study. I hope you find it as interesting as I do. And I thank you again for everyone who does listen and finds just the benefit of studying God's Word and seeing just the depth and the riches. I hope that's what impresses you. The amount of understanding and knowledge is certainly within the realm of everyone's grasp. I'm living proof that it doesn't take anybody very smart, very intelligent. It's all there, and just wanting for us to apply ourselves and seek Him. And He opens our understanding, He opens our hearts, and He helps us to be able to just draw closer to Him as we learn His Word. So we're setting up the stage here in 1 Samuel chapter 13 for a very, very interesting story. So this is the first part. We're going to cut it off before we get to the second part so that we can devote a whole lesson to that second part. But the stage being set here is just really, really fascinating. And so we see on your screen 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting with the first verse. And again, this is taken from Bible Hub, and it's the interlinear Hebrew. And so just want to get you comfortable with that, get you used to seeing it. And so it reads from right to left. And what is interesting here is they'll say, 1 year Saul reigned, and when 2 years he had reigned. Now, what you're going to see here is the translators have really made this readable in English, because in the Hebrew it really says Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign, and then he reigned 2 years. Now, no one would ever translate it that way in English because it just doesn't make sense. But that is what the Hebrew literally says. And this is where we get a better understanding of ancient languages and the challenges that the translators have to translate them into English. If you're an English speaker, or any one of the other thousands of languages that the Bible has been translated to all over the world. But this really helps us understand that of where the Bible comes from, and the language that's there, while being so rich in many areas, is somewhat lacking in others, especially in a verse like this, because literally it says Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign. And we all know that doesn't make sense. And so, okay, how do we deal with that? The translators all will say that that this was the first reign of his first year of his reign, and he really didn't do much until the second year of his reign. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be the case. He would have done something, but again, nothing that the scriptures recorded for us notable until this time frame. But again, the purpose of this is just to show you that we really need to study God's word, and to where Paul admonishes Timothy and us, saying, "Study to show yourself approved of God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." And that's where the original language study really helps us make sure that before we take a position on something, we have the full understanding, and that we're not just going on what a Bible translator may have put into our native language. And it's not that there's a lot of, fear or danger there of going in the wrong direction, but people have come up with some very strange thoughts, even just in the English language alone. And so that's why it's safer that if you have a thought that's seemingly out of the norm, you got to go back to the original language and research it out, because you may not understand the context, you may not understand the situation, and we really sometimes are challenged and have to pull from a lot of different sources and look at a lot of different verses to try to pull this together. One of the things that's really interesting is we don't really know how long Saul was king. Um, they say about 20 some years, but yet what we're going to see in this chapter is Saul's demise, and his rejection from being king happened in a very short period of time. And so this is where it gets really interesting, is trying to research this and trying to see, what happened with Saul here. How long did his kingdom last? There's going to be a lot of other really interesting, I'll say challenging questions we're going to take a look at next week when we get in the second part of this verse on what caused Saul to have his kingdom taken away from him. So I don't want to spoil it now. I want to get you anxious for next week because this is setting the stage for it. So Saul is obviously king. He's reigning. He's starting to do some things here. And he's starting to get an army together. And he chose for himself of Israel 3,000 men. You remember from a previous study we had, that's once he was anointed king, there were men whose hearts were touched that dedicated their mission and their life to being a part of his army, a part of his bodyguard. And so these are more of these men that have surrounded themselves, put themselves in with Saul to be a part of his kingdom. And we see that he starts setting up a little bit of a different fighting groups here. Saul takes 2,000 men with him. And so he's got 3,000. He takes 2/3 and he gives 1/3 to his son Jonathan. Never heard of Jonathan before. First time he shows up in the scriptures. We know that he becomes a friend of David's, and they bond together, and a very close friend. Wonderful relationship that Jonathan has with David. What is interesting here is the name of Jonathan. Remember that every name in the Bible has a deeper meaning than just the face value. And, we really don't know if these were their given names or if these were names that were given to them later to illustrate their character and how they fit together in the story. But with Jonathan, it is a beautiful name because it's actually a two-part name. The name Nathan, or some people are called Nathan, is the Hebrew word for giving. If you give somebody something, you Nathan to them, you give to them. And so we notice that in this word Jonathan, that the first two letters are the Yod and the Vav, which is actually, if you remember how we have pointed out in many verses, that the tetragrammaton, or the name for God, Yud He Vav He, or Yahweh, as it's at least 80% of the people think it's pronounced. These two letters are the first two letters that are used in the tetragrammaton. And so Jonathan means that the Lord, or Yahweh, has given. So again, it's just a beautiful name that Jonathan has. Was this given to him by Mr. and Mrs. Saul when the baby was born, and they said, God has given us this child, and named him Jonathan, or Jonathan, as it's pronounced in Hebrew? We really don't know, but you certainly see the hand of God upon this young man, and he certainly has been given for the scriptures to speak to us. He was given in the life of David to be a confidant and a friend like none other that David had. And Jonathan is just a great Bible character. I love reading about him. And so Jonathan had 1,000 men. Saul had 2,000 men. And it doesn't tell that they had a battle plan or that they had this elaborate scheme set up. But what's interesting here is after these 3,000 men were chosen, Saul sends all the rest of them home. Now, where did they come from? Why were they there? How many had gathered? Was this a selection process that he sent out, notices saying, hey, I'm going to start my own little army here of my soldiers that I want around me all the time. I need 3,000 men. Anybody who wants to apply, come on out, and we'll pick some. And these are the ones that didn't make it and went home. We don't know, but we know something happened, that there were a lot of men there. 3,000 were chosen, and the rest went away. So after they went away, verse 3 occurs, and Jonathan goes out on a little guerrilla mission and does an attack on one of the outposts of the garrisons of the Philistines. Now, we don't know how big of a post this was, how many there were. Obviously, he's got 1,000 men. You can do quite a bit of damage with 1,000 men. And so he attacked the garrison of the Philistines, and obviously he wiped it out. And but it doesn't say that Saul gave him this order. Did he just was he rambunctious and presumptuous on his own, wanting to do this? We don't know any of these things. But what we do see is that this whole narrative that's going on here is obviously set up by God for God to move in the land of Israel, to deliver them from their enemies, because they are heavily oppressed under the Philistines. And that was because they went into idolatry. And so there's a big object lesson here. And so a lot of this, as maybe I'm looking at things differently than I ever used to. Um, I there's two ways we can look at what's happening here. We can look at it and analyze it word for word and say, okay, this is a historical event, that this happened, and somewhere there was a battle and people lost their lives. And that's a very fair way to do it. But there's also another way to look at it is, what is the lesson to be learned here? Why is this in the Bible? Um, what is it meaning to tell us? What is the intention of it to teach us? What are we supposed to come away with from it? And so there's a dual facet of looking at the scriptures. One is just the literal, here's what it says, it's history, God recorded it. But then, well, why did God record it? What is the value of it? Um, that's something that I think hits home with us more, rather than trying to wrap our minds around some of the details of it. Is sometimes we just have to look at it and say, well, God was trying to teach them, you follow idolatry, you go into bondage. You follow idolatry, you're going to have a hard time in life. You're going to be oppressed. You're going to have issues. And you serve God, and your life will be blessed. And so that's what I see happening here in a small way, part of the bigger picture. So the Philistines obviously heard that somebody didn't come home from work that night, and so they sent people to the place where the garrison was, and they're all dead. Well, who did it? Somebody left some calling card or something that identified it as the Israelites. And so the Philistines heard of it, and they obviously were not too happy. You should have realized that this was going to happen. Was that the purpose? Was it to instigate things? Sometimes this was meant to take them to a larger battle. We don't know the purpose, but we do know that it riled the Philistines. And so things started moving, and Saul got out the shofar and blew the horn, and said, come you Hebrews, which is kind of interesting. The word Hebrew is not used very often. And it's kind of interesting. We'll call them Israelites, they'll call them that, but here they use the word Hebrew. And so it's a kind of interesting thought there, as to why he chose that word. Maybe he was trying to unite them for a certain purpose. Now, Israelites would have been a much stronger word if they were in a nationalistic mindset of, let's save the country, let's save, our nation. He would have used the Israelites, but he didn't. He used the Hebrew, which has its roots all the way back to Abraham. So maybe he was, and Hebrew really has a meaning of people that come from the other side of the river. And so, again, very interesting that he went back to what would have been an ancient identification to try to rouse them and rouse their passion of their ancestry to come. Maybe he was playing upon the understanding that God had given this land to Father Abraham, and was hoping to stir them through verbiage like that. And so he blows the trumpet. Obviously, you can't do this in one spot and have it carry for miles and miles and miles. So he had to do more than just blow it in one spot. There had to be messengers that went out and rallied the troops. It's kind of interesting. He just sent the people home, and now in verse 4, he comes and brings them all back again. So how much time went on here? We don't have a great understanding of that. This could have been weeks that have passed or months that have passed from verse 2 to 3 to 4. But he tells them that it was interesting. He said Saul had attacked it. Well, Saul didn't. Jonathan did, but Saul took it upon himself, and they were unified. So obviously Saul had condoned it, but it was kind of interesting that he took the credit for it. And so kind of you start to see maybe a little bit of what kind of person Saul was. And maybe that helps us to understand what's going to happen in the remainder of this chapter and in the chapters that follow when we try to get a feel for what kind of man is Saul. Why did these things happen to him, and why did he do some of the things that he did? This is the groundwork that here Saul took it upon himself to say that he attacked it and he did this. But of course, the Philistines didn't take to it too nicely. And it says here that the Philistines had become an abomination. Really, in some of your translations that you have might see that it is really the word to make a smell, to make a stink, to cause an odor. So, in the reality of it, the Israelites became a stench in the nostrils of the Philistines. That's some pretty strong adjectives there, but it helps you to understand that suddenly the Philistines are just overwhelmed with negativity and animosity towards the Israelites. And so there's this battle brewing, and Saul sees it. Obviously, things don't happen very quickly in those days. They're not mechanized, and they don't travel very fast. So it takes time to pull these groups together. And so Saul rallies the troops, and the Philistines rally their troops. And we get to verse 5, and we see something pretty interesting. The Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and innumerable amounts of people as the sand. Um, Let that sink in a little bit here. 30,000. And how many did Israel have? Three. Can they get more? Probably. But this is 30,000 chariots with horses pulling them, and another 6,000 horses with guys riding them. And behind them or in front of them, who knows, but are people shoulder to shoulder and as numerous as the sand, which means they couldn't even count them. Um, Now, this is really somewhat of a problematic verse because this is a huge number for those days. And let me give you a little comparison as to when Pharaoh sent his army out after the children of Israel who left Egypt. He sent 600 chariots. Now, maybe that's all that was left after the decimation of the plagues, but we also see a reference in Judges where Sisera comes and fights against Israel, and he's got 900 chariots. We see another group that would come, his name being led by a man named Zerah, and he has 300 chariots. So compare those, 600 and 900 and 300 chariots to 30,000 chariots. And, as always intrigues me as to how they estimated the numbers of people. They didn't have drones flying over, taking a picture and counting them so they can make it in the evening news. How do they estimate these people? Um, Again, very, very fascinating, the numbers. Or were, as some commentators think, these numbers are just indications of large quantities. Another fascinating study as to mathematics in this time frame. It did not exist. Basically, people were poor. You didn't have a reason to have numbers that were very large. In fact, Hebrew just has the word for thousand, and you'll see that used often in the scriptures will say there are thousands of thousands or there are hundreds of thousands because they didn't have a word for 100,000 or a million or a billion or a trillion. This was unthinkable. Um, Most of the people were farmers or shepherds. In fact, that's where this term of 99 sheep comes from. It was actually a term that if you had 100 of anything, you were considered rich. If you had less than 100, you were not considered rich. And so for a shepherd to have 99 sheep put him in a different tax bracket, in a different social standing, and he wasn't considered rich. So everyone strived to get 100. And those were big numbers. That was really all that um, influenced their life. There was no reason to count beyond that because there was just nothing that mattered for numbers of that quantity. So many times it's thought that when you see numbers like this, it could be that it's just an estimation. In fact, there are some more ancient copies of the Hebrew Bible that have the word 3,000 in rather than 30,000. That seems to be another interesting number, which again brings up the topic of our Bible translation, our Bible scriptures. The Hebrew Bible, the oldest manuscripts that are available come from about 900 AD. And there are no more ancient manuscripts that were available until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And there we were able to find manuscripts that date from before the time of Christ, a few hundred years before that. And that's why they're so diligent to compare those to see how the copies that we have that exist from about 900 AD compare. Again, very fascinating study of the ancient scriptures. And so some of the ancient copies that may have come from that area will list 3,000. But regardless, it's a large amount of people. And you can see it has a big impact upon the Israelites because when they saw them coming, they freaked out. You get to verse 6. That it was more than they bargained for. And what you see are very interesting adjectives of being in danger, verbs of being distressed, verb of being in danger, just strong language of how they were affected. And then they were so distressed that they deserted. We get to the next part of that verse. It says that they hid themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in holes and in pits. Here's an interesting lesson here as I'm reading through this. Think of what kind of terrain it would take for, say, 30,000 chariots or even 3,000 chariots. Chariots have wheels on them. They're not four-wheel drive. They have to have a fairly flat terrain. They're not going to go up hills. They're not going to climb over mountains. They have to have a flat terrain for them to maneuver in. But yet here are the Israelites not in a flat terrain. And a lot of what we see in pictures of the Middle East, of Israel, Syria, is a very rough and ragged and rugged terrain that you could not maneuver any chariots in. And I know they had places where they would fight their battles. They didn't just fight any old place. They would have areas where combat would take place because the chariots had to be able to maneuver. Obviously, the Israelites vacated that spot where the chariots could go and went to a place chariots could not go. But the fact of, okay, I can understand hiding in caves and in thickets, which gives us the impression that this was a wooded area. And history tells us that at this time, um, the topography was different and it wasn't as barren of a desert as we see today, that the climate was a little bit different, a little bit more lush, a little bit more rainfall. The trees were there were thickets, there was more than just rocks and sand, but they hid in the rocks, which are the caves, in the hole and in holes in the ground. These guys seemed really desperate, and they went in pits. in the ground, trying to get anywhere to find safety. And some of them deserted to faraway land. They crossed over the Jordan River. Obviously, chariots can't go through the water. Um, and so they crossed over the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. And, Saul must have been, he was really freaking out because he still had some people, but look at the mighty men who followed him. It describes them as all trembling. All the people that he had left who didn't desert were trembling. And so now we sit an understanding of what's going through Saul's mind. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, innumerable amounts of people coming his way, and everybody scatters. And everybody who's left is trembling. And you notice they're following behind him. It's like, okay, we anointed you as king. We set you up as king. Now it's time for you to do something, king. And now it's time for you to take charge and help us fight our battles and fight our battles for us. So the pressure on Saul was immense, and the people were trembling. This was annihilation coming here. The most crucial time for Israel that you can imagine. And so with that, we're going to end today's lesson, and we're going to see what happens. Remember how much pressure Saul is under right here, and we're going to see where that pressure leads him. So God bless you. Thank you so much for being a part of this study. I pray that you are blessed by this. I love studying like this. I love God's word, and just to study it and gather the depth and the richness of this is just so incredibly exciting for me. So I pray it is for you too. And God bless you, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.